In this video of accessibility in Webflow, we're going to take a deeper dive into the accessible modal. Now, modals are a staple of modern web design. We see them in slide outs and custom navigation menus and contact form pop-ups. We see them everywhere. And Webflow has a wonderful clonable and a how-to guide to use that clonable. But what we're going to do is take a closer look at the structure of that so that we can reuse and create a component that we can reuse multiple times throughout the same site in different styles and interactions to open and close it, but only using one snippet of JavaScript. So let's get started. Now here is Webflow's Accessible Modal Clonable. If we open it up, we can see that there is the two modals already in here. Now, Webflow has a great how-to guide, and they start the structure here with a modal open button, a modal wrapper, a modal container, a modal close button, and a modal close area. Now, I would argue they're missing the one part out of here, and that is labeled here a div block, because this div block actually contains the entire structure of the modal, and that is important. So we're going to do a quick thing, and we're going to turn this div block into something. We're going to call it a modal component, so that we know that every part within this component is part of that modal. So let's just take a look at that. So we made the modal component. We're going to publish this. We're going to open the modal, and we can see that the modal is accessible because not only can we open the modal with the mouse, we can open the modal and we can navigate within the modal, and the focus stays in the modal when it's accessible. So we can close the modal by pressing escape, or we can close the modal by pressing the button. So that is very important, and in the same way this one does the exact same thing. Now, why the structure is important and why calling this modal component is important is because everything has to go in the modal component. Now, oftentimes we'll use an overlay and reuse it and use a button somewhere else on the page to open that overlay, and that's what we would consider to be a modal. But that's actually not an accessible way of doing it, and I'm going to show you why. So if we take this out of here, barring the fact that it will break the interaction, I've made another one here, and I'm going to call it modal open not accessible, but it's actually going to open it as if we can see that we would normally open it, but I'm going to show you the difference. So this time, when we tab to open the modal, we tab like normal, but now the focus isn't contained within the modal, so it's no longer accessible. In order to close this, we can no longer use the escape button, and we have to go through all the tabbing to get back to that close button in order to close it, which from any kind of user perspective is bad. And why that is because the button, all of the components of the modal have to be within the modal component. We're not just reusing an overlay. We're actually building these components. Now, what the interesting thing to notice, though, is we can design these components in a multitude of ways. as long as we follow the structure and add the accessibility features outlined in the how-to guide from Webflow. So let's first go through the parts that make up the modal. So we have this modal component. We're not doing any styling in it. It's literally a wrapper that we're calling modal component so that we know that everything is in the modal. We have our button. And so it's a modal open button, which is what Webflow uses as far as their naming convention. Now, if we stick with this naming convention, all of these will work with the JavaScript that Webflow provides, which is what enables the modal to be accessible. And on top of that, we can add different combo classes to change styles and the different things, as you'll see later. So that's our open. Then we have a modal wrapper. Now the modal wrapper is what we would think of as an overlay. So the modal wrapper gets a Z index of, they have it 9999, the highest that you can go so that nothing goes on top of it, and a position fixed and whatnot. So that is the modal wrapper. Then you have a modal container. Now the container is any kind of content that you want in this modal. Now this modal container, right now it's got this width of 85% and its max width is 600, but it could be anything. It could be a slide out. It could be anything you want this modal container to look like, to operate like, you can do to this modal container. And all of the content that goes inside of the modal container. What you want is you want the close button. Now the close button can actually be outside of the container or inside the container, but oftentimes it's used similarly to the content. So in this case, the modal close button, again, notice the naming convention is the same, and it's here in the container. Lastly, there's this modal close area. Now the modal close area has a position of fixed as well, and it is within the modal wrapper. And the modal container, because the Z index is higher than the modal close area, you'll notice the modal close area actually doesn't have a Z index. The modal container, because it's higher than that, that's why all of the buttons and stuff are clickable. And the modal close area is what allows you to either click on the close area with a mouse and it will close the modal, or the ability to press escape will also close the modal. So that's our general structure of the modal. Let's just put that back to that. So if you follow this guide, it explains it quite well about what the modal structure is. Again, we want to make sure that we have all of this wrapped in a single div, so it's a whole modal component. And then we're going to add some custom attributes to the modal and the different elements inside of it to make it accessible. So first, we're going to add the role of button to both of the buttons. Now that's because Webflow doesn't actually have a semantic HTML button. It is a link block. And so it's styled like a button, but the actual won't be recognized as a button, but will be recognized as a link. So when we give it the role of button, it tells the screen reader to treat it as a button. So you can see that here, we've added the attribute role of button. Next, on the modal wrapper, this one we have to add a few things to. So we add a role of dialog, an aria dash modal equals true, and we have an aria label or an aria labeled by pop-up modal. And what the aria label does is it tells us what the modal is. Is it a contact form? Is it a navigation? or it can give instructions on what to do with that modal. So if there's something more involved, aria label by is often used to describe what the modal does in another text block. So now we have the modal close area, and that has a tab index of -1 and aria hidden true. Now these properties allow the JavaScript to do the job that it needs to do. So now we come to the JavaScript. And so if you scroll down on this accessibility checklist page, you get to the very end and it has the JavaScript, and it says with the custom code, if you use these particular classes or combo classes, then this JavaScript will work as is. So you copy this JavaScript, copy the code, and we go into our page settings, and I've already done it, but we're going to go into the before body tag and paste all of the JavaScript into here. And remember to hit save, and then your JavaScript is all in there for your modals. And as long as you use the particular classes and everything else, it will work on each and every modal that you use. So let's just take a quick look at some of the things that you can build with this structure. So for instance, you can go to the Accessible Webflow components clonable that we have. You can get the clonable here. I will leave the link in there for it, and it has various accessible clonables in it. So here we have our a navigation, and yes, it's accessible. We have a contact form that is from the Reloom library, so you can even import other components and then just add the combo classes to the components to make them accessible. That's how this system and this wonderful JavaScript that Webflow provides works. We have this these ones here. Again, it's accessible. We can escape it. And yes, we can also use this in a CMS. So this is like a blog list for the CMS, and we use the same slide out kind of thing here. We can scroll down, read through it, and press escape to get out of it, and we're back to where we were on the page. So as you can see, if you take just a little bit of extra time and follow the key structure, add the simple attributes to any kind of thing that you're trying to make a modal, custom pop-out, custom navigation, anything like that, if you just add these few things, pop in the JavaScript that Webflow provides, then you can make your modals accessible completely and take out any of the guesswork out of it. And I bet it's a lot easier than you thought.